Light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. Today I just wanted to offer a few thoughts and reflections on the subject of mortality, which I guess is a very serious subject and one that a lot of people avoid because they're not comfortable with it, which I suppose to me is all the more reason why it needs to be discussed. We need to be able to talk about anything openly so that when it is especially important to talk about those things, we don't have any lack of ability to talk about those things. If, for example, we label death a taboo subject and dying as a taboo subject, no, we don't talk about that, we're only concerned with living. Well, when somebody comes to the end of their life within whatever circumstances then and is faced with dying, suddenly they have this unavoidable experience in front of them, that will happen within the immediate future, within the next few minutes or the next few hours, they're not sure. And there is no freedom to talk about it, to figure out how to understand it, how to address it, how to move through it constructively. And part of the problem, of course, is the difficulty in perceiving or speculating or reporting what's on the other side. If death is not so much a termination point, but a place of radical transformation, where energy that is, according to the law of physics, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it simply changes form. So when we die, where does the energy of our life force, of our bodies, of our minds, of all of that, where does it go? How does it change form once again? These are all sorts of questions that, when it comes time to focus on doing the process of your own crossing back to spirituality and to spiritual form and leaving the physical form, if you have not been able to discuss any of these questions, you'll have the double task of both navigating the process, actually doing it, and also thinking about it, because you won't have a vocabulary for anything you're perceiving or experiencing or expecting. In the final analysis, though, it's very much an individual kind of perception and interpretation, and what's at the heart of all of this is the way that we assign meaning. Because so much that has become familiar is coming to an end, there is something in the human spirit that requires it be meaningful in order for it not to be a defeat. It's not that we are conquered by death, but rather that we move through death like a revolving door. We just can't see what's on the other side of the door. It's not that we are defeated and ended, but rather that that part of us which is eternal goes somewhere, somehow, that our current technology can't adequately document. Goodness knows there are so many wondrous things that we have not developed the technology to measure, but somehow we know they're there, or at least we know there's something. We can't prove that there's nothing, nor can we prove what we would like to believe, and so we're kind of caught between the two. And there's a sense in which all of physical life is being caught between the two, coming from a spiritual place into a physical form and returning to a spiritual place again, but somehow different than when we arrived. That somehow the soul has grown through this experience, and that because this incarnation, this physical experience, is where the growth of the soul appears to happen, it's important, I think, that we take it seriously. But whether we decide to believe in any of the various deities or none, whether we decide to regard the divine as divine mystery, as transcendent love and transcendent wisdom that exceeds human comprehension, as we're coming to terms with the fact that we are here for a limited, finite amount of time, that we are essentially the finite touching the infinite, there's a sense in which our mortality, or the moment of death, is the doorway between the two, where we go through this incredible transition, and suddenly we're no longer finite again. We're somehow contained, we're a smaller piece of infinity contained within a larger piece of infinity. I don't know that human language is really able to describe it. But not talking about it, or fearing this transition, or fearing the greater part of who we are outside this life, is clearly not going to empower us to deal with it constructively. If anything, we'll be running from ourselves and getting nowhere, because you can't run from yourself. Every time you stop running, even when you are in the process of running, you're still right there. It's as if it would be like trying to run from yourself, trying to run from your own feet. You're using your feet to do the running, however, so of course you're never getting 1 millimeter further from your feet because they're part of you. Well, our mortality is part of us also. And we can refuse to talk about it. We can say there's too many questions that I can't answer. We can make whatever excuse we want. But none of those will empower us to make the best use of the life we have while we're within this mortal sort of framework between birth and death. So, I'm not afraid of death myself. I'm not afraid to talk about it. But I'm also not willing to place any guarantees or make any firm statements, because there's so many different possibilities that have been articulated, and I strongly suspect that the reality of death is so multidimensional that no human language is able to accurately describe what is happening or how it is happening. You know, where the consciousness comes from and where it goes and by what form of energy it goes and through what dimensions it goes. You know, at one point in time, the 3 dimensions of physical life, I guess, were regarded as all there was. And then we began to think of time as a 4th dimension. And now, through various science fiction shows and whatnot, there's the human creative psyche, I guess you could say, has explored the idea of there being multiple dimensions. Mathematically, I'm told they can prove the existence of at least 10 dimensions. The problem is that with each higher dimension, it takes more and more and more energy to reach it. And for some of the higher dimensions, all the generators on Earth couldn't create enough energy to propel us into that dimension. In the same way that it takes more energy to stand up on 2 feet and move through 3-dimensional space than to slide across the floor on 2 dimensions. In a similar sort of way, as soon as you go each dimension higher, it takes more energy to do it. In the midst of all that, we're still left with this basic question of whether we have accomplished a place of being comfortable with our own mortality, whether we are accepting the fact that each year each of us grows older, that in order to have ability in the later years, we have to invest in maintaining that ability in the early years, that everything we've done, everything we've consumed, every exercise we didn't do, that all these things have consequences, and that part of living in a finite frame of time and part of being incarnated finite material beings is that those consequences of all the choices we made and all the situations we've done and we've been in, that all this has to do with what we will experience and what we will remember. If we are so uncomfortable with the question of mortality that no thought is given to the larger context around it, I'm sure it would be quite terrifying to think that it's all about to end. I imagine it would be rather surprising for people who expected nothing to be there to suddenly find that there was something there. Obviously, in a much greater way than Columbus sailing westward across the ocean, expecting to land in China and finding there was this whole continent in the way. He didn't expect North America to be here, but it was, and it changed everything about his thinking and about the world of his time. In wrestling with mortality, and thereby being confronted with the ways that we have assigned meaning or refused to assign meaning, resisting the fact of mortality by refusing to assign meaning does not lengthen one's finite existence. If anything, it disempowers it, which is why I suppose every belief system in every country and culture around the world has had to come up with some answer to what happens what happens when the heart stops beating and the lungs stop breathing and the brain slowly stops functioning. What happens? And is there any way to explore that? There was a movie that came out quite a number of years ago called Flatliners, which was about some students at a medical school who were experimenting on themselves, that they would literally kill themselves and then wait a certain amount of time and then revive themselves and record and report and compare and contrast their experiences of what they perceived and remembered during the time that they were clinically dead. And of course the growing tension of the movie is that it evolved quickly into some sort of competition. Who could stay dead the longest and still be revived? And of course the longer it went, the more difficult it became to truly revive each student, and at one point they were afraid that they wouldn't be able to bring somebody back because they were trying and trying and trying, and his body wasn't responding. And finally succeeding, but deciding at that point that there would be no more, because their spirit, their sense of competition had gotten away with them. That each one wanted to outdo the others, and yet the fascinating thing was that none of them had the same experience. For each individual, it was a completely unique experience, and if I remember correctly, for each time, for each individual, it was a unique experience. It wasn't like death was a wormhole or a portal or a tube between New York and Denver, Colorado, where you die in Denver and wake up in New York. You die in New York and you wake up in Denver. It wasn't that kind of bridge between geography. It was differences in perception, differences in experience, all of which were very much colored by the ways that people assign meaning. It seems to me the more I've thought about death, the less afraid of it I am, and the more I'm able to draw from that ways to live much more fully and to value each moment of my life much more fully, and to value that part of life which I can't see, to validate that it's real as far as I can tell. Ultimately all we have is a perception. But if we can listen to and pay attention to that perception and utilize that perception, at least I found that I get a lot more out of life, because I notice things that I wouldn't otherwise notice, and because I can go places and understand that differences in language, differences in color, in culture, in clothing, in costume, in food, in mannerisms, in religion, that underneath it all there's still this basic commonality of a physical being having a birth and a death, and the energy going someplace thereafter, but we're not entirely sure where, and trying to find enough meaning in our finiteness, in our mortality, in the fact that we're not going to live forever in the bodies that we currently inhabit, that these bodies break down and wear out, and they begin to, the more of a story the body has to carry, the more that story becomes manifest. I'm not sure how else to put it. The person who has lived longer, in general, there are all kinds of, be it scars, wrinkles, predispositions, ways of moving, all sorts of things by which the body tells the story of how far it's been and what it's been through. I have a scar on my leg where I was attacked by a dog when I was 10. I have various other sorts of quirks to the way my body works and how many wrinkles it has and so forth that would correspond to the climates in which I've lived, the places I've traveled, and the things I've done. For a long time in high school, I was doing so much writing that I developed a callus on the side of my finger exactly where the pencil fit. And so you could look at my hands and begin to tell all sorts of things about me. Because now I'm typing much more than writing, the callus has gone away. It was there for a while, but now it's gone. In addressing our own mortality, though, it's coming to terms with accepting in some psychologically healthy way that there will be a time to be gone. When it comes to death, I'm really not afraid of it. That doesn't make me reckless. It makes me, or it helps me to perceive a connection between where I am and where I'll be. It allows for love to be the rainbow bridge, as some people say, between this reality and a different one. And not until I cross the rainbow bridge will I really begin to explore what the definition and meaning and dimensions of that other reality are. But I'm not afraid of it, I guess, is what it comes down to. An interesting thing as I pondered this, though, was I could say pretty much for my whole life I'm not afraid of it. When the time comes, something deep inside of me knows that that which is truly God will be there, and that something wise and loving and full of life will be there, and something full of joy will be there. I don't have to worry about it. And I don't know where that knowledge comes from. But it occurred to me after a while of pondering this, long after I finished college, in fact, that, I don't mind the going. It's the being gone that really bothers me. It's the not having any more say or part or contribution to the unfolding of life here that really bothers me. Because I so much have always wanted to be a part of things, to contribute something beautiful and loving, and hopefully wise, hopefully with a little bit of insight someplace, to wherever I was. And because of that, sometimes has been very frustrating when I've been excluded because someone regarded me as being just a little too different in some way or another. And yet, as I watch the way they interact with their lives, it's been almost sad sometimes. I remain somewhat neutral because I'm just observing, but a little bit sad when I see how they're not utilizing their mortality as wisely as they could. They're allowing large amounts of time to be wasted, horrendous amounts of important words to go unsaid, explorations and self-development to go undone. One of my favorite literary works is the play Our Town by Thornton Wilder. And in the third act, Emily comes back to look back on her life with the narrator of the play, and he encourages her to pick some inconspicuous moment that wasn't terribly important one way or the other, which she found a strange request, judging by her answer, but agreed. And so they went back to visit an ordinary day in her life, and she was appalled at how people were going through the motions without really thinking about where they were, or what they were doing, or the fact that time was running out. Because she died in childbirth as a young woman, according to the play, and if I remember correctly, and was quite stunned at, what, you mean it's over already? But I barely got started. And as she's, post-mortem, after she's died, she's looking back at the people in her life who, of course, can no longer see her, and she finally says to the narrator, doesn't anyone know they live while they do it? And I think that's essentially the challenge when it comes to issues of mortality. Do we know we live while we do it? And to understand that each moment is precious, that it won't come again, that there will be a youthful time for certain things. There will be an elderly time for other things, that before all that was a childhood time for certain things. And that if we don't use the times as wisely and wonderfully and lovingly as we can, there simply won't be any time left at a certain point. And we won't be able to do what we could have done while we were there. And to touch the lives that we were able to touch, to be fully present with all that we have to contribute and all we have to offer. And I can only hope, I guess, that when my time comes and I'm gone, that first of all, somebody here believes in carrying on the pursuit of wisdom and love, that everything in which I believed and everything toward which I worked won't pass away with me, that somehow the contribution I've made will make a difference. But it remains clear in my mind, I guess, that with each show I record, it's a passing of time, and I want to put as much wisdom in it as I can to leave a note in a bottle, so to speak, for future generations. That there will be some way that maybe what I'm saying in this show can inspire their thoughts, and they can make discoveries beyond anything I've made, and carry the torch of life that much further. You know, for a large part of my adult life, my primary family has been my dogs, because my own biological family decided that they had no use for an openly gay person, so I'm pretty much by myself. But the difficulty, and where this subject of mortality really comes home, is that every time I get a new puppy, and all the dogs I have at the present time I've had since they were very young puppies. On the day they arrive, I welcome them with joy. I'm thrilled to have them and see them, and I know even in that moment that it is more likely than not that I will outlive this creature, that this creature has come into my life to love and to give as much joy as it can, that it will have certain limitations and quirks, that it may even have psychological and emotional problems. Most of my dogs have not had that, but at the moment I'm dealing with one dog that does. He's very loving most of the time, but less than 1% of the time he has psychological and emotional problems for which there doesn't seem to be any answer. But in every case, I get to welcome them into life, and I get to nurture them through life, and I have the expectation that I carry with me of being there when it's time for them to leave this life. And in most cases, probably will mean that I have to bear the very difficult decision of deciding which day is the day to say thank you and send them on their way, to allow them over the rainbow bridge rather than cling to them selfishly when their quality of life has diminished too low because of age, because of conditions or illnesses or whatever. If I love them, I need to make their going just as beautiful as their being here was, and just as surrounded by love as their being here was. If for dogs there is an equivalent of having Alzheimer's, I know if it were myself and I were diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I would specifically choose an appropriate and appropriately timed euthanasia, rather than being held on to in this life to the last possible gasp, when my brain had long and my consciousness had long since departed and my body just wasn't shutting down and I was nothing but a shell wandering around in a facility somewhere. I worked in a facility like that briefly at one point, and they were real people, and I wanted them to know love as much as possible. But their minds were in such a state that most of the time they didn't know whether they were coming or going or what happened yesterday. And to me it seemed tragic. I understand there's a wide variety of opinions on that. I know for myself I would not want to go through that, and I would want someone to love me enough to say, it's been a good life, let's have one big party and say goodbye and call it quits, because there is no reason to drag this out to where it is causing more emotional harm than good. it's time at some point to let go and to accept the fact of one's mortality. I pray and I earnestly hope that I have somehow scratched the surface and got your thoughts going during the last half hour, that in whatever way you choose to do with your own mortality, that you will find the joy and the peace and the wisdom that will allow you to treat every moment as a treasure, to be able to say, yes, it has been good. Thank you for this time. I'm ready. And to go. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this has all been helpful to your personal and spiritual growth. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be.